is rather cozy inside. Looks like you've got pillows and blankets. You've made yourself a perfect little nest, haven't you? Oh, you have a book? Let me see. Oh, wow. Beatrix Potter, The Complete Mr. Rabbit? That was silly. Peter Rabbit. This is a beautiful book. I love how the light catches on the gold bits. Very pretty. Did you know I used to have this book? Well, not this book. My Peter Rabbit books weren't quite as glamorous. But they were fun to read. Do you want me to read you some? Are you sure? You're looking a little sleepy. You might fall asleep if I read too much. Okay. Do you want me to show you the pictures? Or do you want to close your eyes and picture it in your head? Okay, well here's what I'll do. I'll read, and before I turn the page, I'll show you the pictures. Deal? Okay. Once upon a time, there were 4 little rabbits, and... Oh. Was there something wrong with how I was reading? Oh. You want me to do my secret voice? Okay. Since it's just you and me, I'll do my secret voice. Just for you. Once upon a time, there were 4 little rabbits, and their names were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. They lived with their mother in a sandbank underneath the root of a very big fir tree. "Now, my dears," said old Mrs. Rabbit one morning, "you may go into the fields or down the lane, but don't go into Mr. McGregor's garden. Your father had an accident there. He was put in a pie by Mrs. McGregor." "Now run along and don't get into mischief. I'm going out." Then old Mrs. Rabbit took a basket and her umbrella and went through the wood to the baker's. She bought a loaf of bread and 5 currant buns. Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail, who were good little bunnies, went down the lane to gather blackberries. But Peter, who was very naughty, ran straight away to Mr. McGregor's garden and squeezed under the gate. First, he ate some lettuces and some French beans, and then he ate some radishes. Then, feeling rather sick, he went to look for some parsley. But round the end of a cucumber frame, who should he meet but Mr. McGregor? Mr. McGregor was on his hands and knees, planting out young cabbages, but he jumped up and ran after Peter, waving a rake and calling out, "Stop, thief!" Peter was most dreadfully frightened. He rushed all over the garden, for he had forgotten the way back to the gate. He lost one of his shoes among the cabbages, and the other shoe amongst the potatoes. After losing them, he ran on 4 legs and went faster, so that I think he might have got away altogether, if he had not unfortunately run into a gooseberry net and got caught by the large buttons on his jacket. It was a blue jacket with brass buttons, quite new. Peter gave himself up for lost and shed big tears, but his sobs were overheard by some friendly sparrows, who flew to him in great excitement and implored him to exert himself. don't worry. I've read this book lots of times. I know how it ends. Peter's gonna be all right, I promise. Yes, I promise. You'll just have to keep reading to find out. Okay. Mr. McGregor came up with a sieve, which he intended to pop on top of Peter, but Peter wriggled out just in time, leaving his jacket behind him, and rushed into the tool shed and jumped into a can. It would have been a beautiful thing to hide in, if it had not had so much water in it. That is pretty funny, isn't it? Poor Peter. Mr. McGregor was quite sure that Peter was somewhere in the tool shed, perhaps hidden under a flower pot. He began to turn them over carefully, looking under each. Presently, Peter sneezed. Ka-choo! Mr. McGregor was after him in no time, and tried to put his foot on top of Peter, who jumped out of a window, upsetting 3 plants. The window was too small for Mr. McGregor, and he was tired of running after Peter. He went back to his work. Oh, I did forget to show you the pictures. I'm sorry. Better. Peter sat down to rest. He was out of breath and trembling with fright, and he had not the least idea which way to go. Also, he was very damp with sitting in that can. After a time, he began to wander about, going lippity-lippity, not very fast, and looking all around. He found a door in a wall, but it was locked, and there was no room for a fat little rabbit to squeeze underneath. An old mouse was running in and out over the stone doorstep, carrying peas and beans to her family in the wood. Peter asked her the way to the gate, but she had such a large pea in her mouth that she could not answer. She only shook her head at him. Peter began to cry. Then he tried to find his way straight across the garden, but he became more and more puzzled. Presently, he came to a pond where Mr. McGregor filled his water cans. A white cat was staring at some goldfish. She sat very, very still, but now and then the tip of her tail twitched as if it were alive. Peter thought it best to go away without speaking to her. He had heard about cats from his cousin, little Benjamin Bunny. He went back toward the tool shed, but suddenly, quite close to him, he heard the noise of a hoe. Scritch, scratch, scratch, scritch. Peter scuttered underneath the bushes, but presently, as nothing happened, he came out and climbed upon a wheelbarrow and peeped over. The first thing he saw was Mr. McGregor hoeing onions. His back was turned towards Peter, and beyond him was the gate. Peter got down very quietly off the wheelbarrow and started running as fast as he could go, along a straight walk behind some blackcurrant bushes. Mr. McGregor caught sight of him at the corner, but Peter did not care. He slipped underneath the gate and was safe at last in the wood outside the garden. Mr. McGregor hung up the little jacket and shoes for a scarecrow to frighten the blackbirds. Peter never stopped running or looked behind him till he got home to the big fir tree. He was so tired that he flopped down upon the nice soft sand on the floor of the rabbit hole and shut his eyes. His mother was busy cooking. She wondered what he had done with his clothes. It was the second little jacket and pair of shoes that Peter had lost in a fortnight. I am sorry to say that Peter was not very well during the evening. His mother put him to bed and made some chamomile tea, and she gave a dose of it to Peter. 1 tablespoon to be taken at bedtime. But Flopsy Topsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail had bread and milk and blackberries for supper. The end. That was a good story, wasn't it? I do love these books. They don't write them this way anymore. No, they don't. I'm not at all sure why. Did you know that Beatrix Potter was a good painter? If I remember correctly, I think she painted all of the drawings in this book. I could be wrong about that, but I think so. Oh, honey, you're looking very sleepy. You know, it's almost time for a nap. What do you think about heading to bed? No, you're not tired. I understand. Of course not. Silly me. Whatever was I thinking? Well, in that case, since you're not tired, you won't mind one more story? No? Okay. But maybe this time, just shut your eyes and try to picture what's happening in your head. Do you want a blanket? Here, I've got one from the tent. Okay. Let's get this wrapped up around you. I always loved being snuggled up when my parents read me stories. I know your mom and dad aren't here right now. They have to work. I know, working is so very boring. But I think they would love to tuck you in if they could. They love you, you know. Well, thank you. I'm glad you like hanging out with me. I like hanging out with you. I think it's a lot of fun. But I am not your parents. Your mom and dad love you in a way I could never. Okay. All snuggled? Ready for another story? Okay. Which one should we do? Is there a glossary? Oh, a glossary is kind of like a table of contents. It shows you all the stories in the book and what pages they're on. Makes it very easy to find just the right story you're looking for. Should I read some? And you can choose which one we read next. Okay. We read The Tale of Peter Rabbit, so we don't need to do that one. Next is The Tale of Squirrel Nutkin, The Tailor of Gloucester, The Tale of Benjamin Bunny, The Tale of Two Bad Mice, The Tale of Mrs. Tiggywinkle. That is a funny one. The Tale of the Pie and the Patty Pan. You like Mrs. Tiggywinkle? Okay. I don't think I've read that story before, so this will be interesting for both of us. Page is on 85. Here we go. The Tale of Mrs. Tiggywinkle. Oh, Tiggywinkle. My mistake. So sorry. Good thing you're here to help me. Okay. Once upon a time, there there was a little girl called Lucy who lived at a farm called Littletown. She was a good little girl, only she was always losing her pocket handkerchiefs. One day, little Lucy came into the farmyard crying. Oh, she did cry so. I've lost my pocket hankin, 3 hankins and a penny. Have you seen them, Tabby Kitten? The kitten went on washing her white paws, so Lucy asked a speckled hen, Sally Hennypenny, have you found 3 pocket hankins? But the speckled hen ran into a barn, clacking, I go barefoot, barefoot, barefoot. And then Lucy asked Cock Robin, sitting on a twig. Cock Robin looked sideways at Lucy with his bright black eyes, and he flew over a stile and away. Lucy climbed upon the stile and looked up at the hill behind Littletown, a hill that goes up, up into the clouds, as though it had no top, and a great way up the hillside. She thought she saw some white things spread upon the grass. Lucy scrambled up the hill as fast as her short legs would carry her. She ran along a steep pathway, up and up, until Littletown was right away down below. She could have dropped a pebble down the chimney. Presently she came to a spring, bubbling out from the hill. Someone had stood a tin can upon a stone to catch the water, but the water was already running over, for the can was no bigger than an egg cup. And where the sand upon the path was wet, there were footmarks of a very small person. Lucy ran on and on. The path ended under a big rock. The grass was short and green, and there were clothes props cut from bracken stems, with lines of plaited brushes, and a heap of tiny clothespins, but no pocket handkerchiefs. But there was something else, a door, straight into the hill, and inside it someone was singing. Lily white and clean, oh, with little frills between, oh, smooth and hot, red rusty spot, never here be seen, oh. Lucy knocked once, twice, and interrupted the song. A little frightened voice called out, Who's that? Lucy opened the door, and what do you think there was inside the hill? A nice clean kitchen, with a flagged floor and wooden beams, just like any other farm kitchen, only the ceiling was so low that Lucy's head nearly touched it, and the pots and pans were small, and so was everything else. There was a nice hot, singy smell, and at the table, with an iron in her hand, stood a very stout, short person, staring anxiously at Lucy. Her print gown was tucked up, and she was wearing a large apron over her striped petticoat. Her little black nose went sniffle, 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 and her bright eyes twinkle, twinkle, and underneath her cap, where Lucy had yellow curls, that little person had prickles. Who are you? Asked Lucy. Have you seen my Pocket Hankins? The little person made a bob curtsy. Oh, yes, if you please, my name is Mrs. Tiggywinkle. Oh, yes, if you please, I'm an excellent clear starter. She took something out of her clothes basket and spread it on the ironing blanket. What's that thing? Said Lucy. That's not my pocket hankin. Oh, no, if you please, that's a little scarlet waistcoat belonging to Cock Robin. And she ironed it and folded it and put it on one side. Then she took something else off a clothes horse. Isn't that my pinny? Said Lucy. Oh, no, if you please, that's a damask tablecloth belonging to Jenny Wren. Look how it's stained with currant wine. It's very bad to wash, said Mrs. Tiggywinkle. Mrs. Tiggywinkle's nose went sniffle, sniffle, snuffle, and her eyes went twinkle, twinkle, and she fetched another hot iron from the fire. There's one of my pocket hankins, cried Lucy, and there's my pinny. Mrs. Tiggywinkle ironed it and goffered it and shook out the frills. Oh, that is lovely, said Lucy. And what are those long yellow things with fingers like gloves? Oh, that's a pair of stockings belonging to Sally Hennypenny. Look how she's worn the heels out with scratching in the yard. She'll very soon go barefoot, said Mrs. Tiggywinkle. Why, there's another handkerchief, but it isn't mine, it's red. Oh, no, if you please, that's one belonging to old Mrs. Rabbit, and it did so smell of onions. I've had to wash it separately. I can't get out the smell. There's another one of mine, said Lucy. What are those funny little white things? That's a pair of mittens belonging to Tabby Kitten. I only have to iron them. She washes them herself. There's my last pocket hankin, said Lucy. And what are you dipping into the basin of starch? They're little dicky shirt fronts belonging to Tom Titmouse. Most terrible peculiar, said Mrs. Tiggywinkle. Now I've finished my ironing, I'm going to air some clothes. What are these dear soft fluffy things? Said Lucy. Oh, those are woolly coats belonging to the little lamb, said Skagel. Will their jackets take off? Asked Lucy. Oh, yes, if you please, look at the sheep marks on the shoulder. And here's one marked for Gategarth, and 3 that come from Littletown. They're always marked at washing, said Mrs. Tiggywinkle. And she hung up all sorts and sizes of clothes, small brown coats of mice, and one velvety black moleskin waistcoat, and a red tailcoat with no tail belonging to Squirrel Nutkin, and a very much shrunk blue jacket belonging to Peter Rabbit, and a petticoat, not marked, that had gone lost in the washing, and at last the basket was empty. Then Mrs. Tiggywinkle made tea, a cup for herself and a cup for Lucy. They sat before the fire on a bench and looked sideways at one another. Mrs. Tiggywinkle's hand, holding the teacup, was very, very brown and very, very wrinkly with the soap suds, and all through her gown and her cap there were hairpins sticking wrong ends out, so that Lucy didn't like to sit too near her. When they had finished tea, they tied up the clothes in bundles, and Lucy's pocket handkerchiefs were folded up inside her clean pinny and fastened with a silver safety pin. And then they made up the fire with turf and came out and locked the door and hid the key under the door sill. Then away down the hill trotted Lucy and Mrs. Tiggywinkle with the bundles of clothes. All the way down the path, little animals came out of the fern to meet them. The very first that they met were Peter Rabbit and Benjamin Bunny. And she gave them their nice clean clothes, and all the little animals and birds were so very much obliged to dear Mrs. Tiggywinkle, so that at the bottom of the hill, when they came to the stile, there was nothing left to carry except Lucy's one little bundle. Lucy scrambled up the stile, and with the bundle in her hand, and then she turned to say, "Good night," and to thank the washerwoman. But what a very odd thing! Mrs. Tiggywinkle had not waited either for thanks or for the washing bill. She was running up the hill, and where was her white frilled cap, and her shawl, and her gown, and her petticoat? And how small she had grown, and how brown, and covered with prickles! Why, Mrs. Tiggywinkle was nothing but a hedgehog. Now, some people say that little Lucy had been asleep upon the stile, but then how could she have found 3 clean pocket hankins and a penny pinned with a silver safety pin? And besides, I have seen that little door into the back of the hill called Cat Bells, and besides, I am very well acquainted with dear Mrs. Tiggywinkle,